Today on the What If Brigade, I want to make a response video to Matt Easton about spear points. And a couple of quick points before we get started. I am not filming where I normally live. I am watching a chicken, a duck, and two cats. Please bear with any wildlife noises you hear in the background. And the second point I want to make is that I am far from an expert on using a spear. I have used a spear, but I don't own a spear, and obviously I don't have one at this particular residence. So this will be my stand-in for a spear and also for a pole arm. It's kind of halfway between both, right? But in Matt Easton's video, he really talked about the different shapes of spear points and during the age of armor, and how some of them we might expect spear points to be like the points of arrows or rondel daggers or the spikes on the end of pole arms in terms of being used to get into the gaps and chinks of armor and puncture armor. But that isn't necessarily what we find with spears. We basically find a really triangular, diamond-shaped spearhead, and typically without the lugs that we would see on a boar spear, and that's that's not optimal for piercing armor. So why is that? And the first point that I wanted to bring up is that with the exception of arrows, which are very unique in their own right, when we're talking about rondel daggers or the spike on a pole arm, those are secondary weapons. That is, a rondel dagger is not what you take into battle with you. The spike on a pole arm is not its primary function. It is a function, yes, but that is not what you use first. And so I think when we look at these spears, one of the things that we can say about them is that they are a primary weapon, and it is actually unusual for the primary weapon to be focused on armor penetration. And I think there's a very good reason for this. To penetrate armor, you really have to get into those gaps. It has to be a precise strike. It can't be deflected at all, and you typically need to have some kind of advantage. With a rondel dagger, you usually proceed using the rondel dagger with some form of wrestling. You want to get the person on the ground where they can't move, and then you go for the gap in the armor. And I'm not an expert on pole arms, even worse than spears, but I believe pole arms is a much the same way, in that the spike on the end of the pole arm is not the primary weapon. You would be using the hammer or the axe or the hook, and you would be setting up a person before you would attempt to use an armor-piercing spike. And I think when we're talking about spears, we're really talking about the same sort of thing. In this era, we don't see a long, thin spear shaft. We see a nice, thick spear shaft, and we see that really strong diamond-pointed spear. And unlike this one here, it has reinforced ridges on the side to make it super, super strong. And in that case, that is really good in terms of that spear, in that we can use it against armor, and we don't have to be worried about the spear breaking, but we also don't have to hit the armor in precisely the correct place. And I think a great example of this is you could use a spear like that, and you could bash somebody in the head really, really hard, and you know what? It's not going to go through a gap anywhere on the helmet, but it is going to hit really hard, and it's got a big enough, strong enough point that if it catches on anything, if it catches on a groove in the armor or a gap or anything like that, it's going to impact. And so you can essentially bash someone in the head with one of these spears. And I think that's worthwhile, and it works the same way. It works the same way on the knees. It's really thick, so you could conceivably sweep the legs. You could turn around, use the butt of the spear. It you can use that spear for a lot um, in combat, even because it's a really robust spear, and so even though it's not going to puncture armor, it still functions against armor. It's not going to break very easily. It's going to hit with a lot of force, and people are going to know that you're using a spear on them. And so even if they're in full plate, that's that spear is still going to be able to do a lot of the things that you want it to do. And I think that's uh, you know there's a in terms of, yes, uh, you know a pole arm is probably better. It's got that spike, plus it's got maybe an axe and a hammer, maybe a hook on it. It's got all kinds of things. But if you knew how to use a pole arm, you'd probably have a pole arm. If you have a spear, you are probably not skilled enough to use a pole arm. It's probably not that there isn't a pole arm available. It's you were assigned to the spear corps because you are really strong and you're going to bash, bash, bash the enemy. Not that if you had the ability to do hooking motions and cut things, cut straps, and find the chinks in the armor and pierce in exactly the correct place, you would have a pole arm. That's kind of how it would work. Okay, maybe there might be exceptions to this, but for the most part, uh, in the era where pole arms are available, the reason you don't have a pole arm is because you don't know how to do those things. And so in that case, a spear is really easy. And the like I said, yes, you will not ever punch through armor with just the force of your spear, but you might knock someone over, and then you can go for your rondel dagger, and it's still over for the person in armor because you were able to use your primary weapon in order to get them into a position where your secondary weapon would work. And maybe it's the row behind you using the rondel daggers, that sort of thing. But a big part of fighting people in armor isn't just finding the gaps. That's obviously important in duels and in one-on-one fighting, but as a group, if you get a whole bunch of people in armor on their backs, you don't have to be the person to find the gaps. That can be somebody else. There can be somebody else basically working on the people in armor. And I'd also say that, especially as a spearman, you don't necessarily want to kill all of those people in armor. I mean, yes, you don't want to die. Yes, you are fighting, but prisoners in this era are valuable, and especially high-ranking prisoners, if they have nice armor. Hitting them in the head really hard and getting them on their back and wrestling them into submission is probably worth a lot more money than finding a chink in their armor and stabbing them in the armpit so they bleed out on the battlefield. They're not really worth anything dead. And I think that a lot of times when we're looking at these weapons, we're thinking about, we're thinking from a modern perspective, maybe a video game perspective or a role-playing perspective, where we want one weapon to do all of the things, and we want to win a particular fight by killing our opponent. But in a battlefield, really each person is going to have different roles. The archers are not trying to do the same thing as the people with pole arms, as the people who are the cavalry, and so each of those groups has their own role. And the spear is built that way because the people who are using that spear have a different role than puncturing armor, or they have a secondary weapon that they use to puncture armor after they get the person on the ground. But I would say that's actually the norm. I think that for the most part, finding a gap in the armor is hard work, and you need to be up close and personal to do it. And you want, again, with the exception of the bow and the crossbow, you want to use a primary weapon to get yourself into a good position to find a chink in the armor, because you're not necessarily going to be able to do that from a long distance very easily. It's really easy for your opponent to deflect your thrust only slightly, and you don't hit that chink in the armor, and then it doesn't really do anything. Where if your goal is not to hit the chink in the armor, if your goal is to hit somebody really hard and knock them on their back, it doesn't really matter that that blow is deflected slightly. They have to deflect it all the way. And if they're deflecting it all the way, and you are a row of spearmen, their act of parrying your weapon that far down leaves them open to the guy on your right and the person on your left, and other thrusts can get in. And that really, the fact that it takes more force to knock your weapon offline means a lot. Now, could you do the same thing with a rondel dagger point on your spear? Sort of. I think you would break it, is my humble opinion. Again, I haven't used spears all that much, but you can generate a whole lot of force with a spear, and if there's a little tiny point on it and you hit something really hard, especially something metal, whether it's chainmail or plate, I think you could bend or shatter that point. Where in the robust spearheads that Matt Easton was asking about, it does not look like they would bend or break very easily. And it looks like even if you blunted them, they would still do a considerable amount of impact force. So even if the tip just got totally blunted by repeated bashings, it's still going to hit things pretty hard. I think he had an example that was for practice or LARP, and it had a deliberately blunted end, and even that looked like it would hit you like a hammer, and I think that's kind of what it's supposed to do. It does have a point in that that point will be useful if you do find a gap, if you're up against horses, if there are people who are more lightly armored, those kinds of things, maybe wearing gambeson or something like that. Maybe you can find somebody with an open helm, but it doesn't. The weapon doesn't degrade significantly once that tip is blunted, because it's not designed to penetrate. It's not designed to penetrate very far. You're doing most of your damage with the thrust, with the impact force of the spear. So, what do you think? Would you rather have a narrow, pointy spearhead for getting in the chinks of armor, or would you rather have a very strong triangle-shaped spearhead so that it can withstand a lot of impacts? Do you think that what I'm saying makes any sense in regards to the usage and the armor of spears? Obviously, again, I am not an expert with spears. I just had this idea, so I decided to make this video. So if you are a spear expert or you have your own ideas, please put them in the comments down below. Have a great day.